show. This is the first episode in this series, and in this series we are going to be dealing strictly with the Raspberry Pi Zero. So the first thing that we have to get out of the way are the requirements. I don't know in what way you guys are going to be purchasing your Raspberry Pi Zero. There are obviously different ways that you could purchase it. The main thing that I want you guys to understand is this. There are actually more than one Raspberry Pi Zero. So when you go out there to make your purchase, whether you're going to a store like Micro Center or you are buying it from an online retailer, I want you to just make sure that you are purchasing the appropriate Raspberry Pi Zero. The one that we're going to be working with in this series is the Raspberry Pi Zero WH. There are actually three different kinds of Raspberry Pi Zeros. You have the Raspberry Pi Zero, and that has no Wi-Fi capabilities on board. And then you have the Raspberry Pi Zero W, which does have the capability of Wi-Fi on board. And then you have the third type, which is the Raspberry Pi Zero WH, which not only has the capability of Wi-Fi on board, but it also has headers that are pre-soldered. So it is this latter that I have here, and this is what I'm going to be using in the series. It is not necessarily what you have to use, but you at least have to make sure that you are using a Raspberry Pi Zero W. Why would you want the Raspberry Pi Zero WH? Well, if you're like me and you have absolutely no experience or knowledge of how to solder, then that's why. Okay, so next on the list is a case. What I have here is a basic case that is made by the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and one of the things that I really like about this case is that it is essentially one case, but it has three different tops. You have the option of changing out that front plate depending on what it is that you're using that Raspberry Pi for. You are essentially getting 3 for 1. As you can see, you have one base, and then you have 3 different cover plates, and each one of those cover plates differs from the next. Alright, so next on the list, we need to power the Raspberry Pi Zero. So what we have here is a basic power cord that we're going to use to power the Raspberry Pi Zero. So this is just your basic micro USB charging cable. There is a switch that has been added. It's just a very convenient thing to have, especially when it comes to powering on and powering off your Raspberry Pi Zero, and that is something that you'll understand a little bit more in the future as we get into that. So if you can get one, I definitely encourage you to get a power cord that has an on and off switch on it like this one. And as you can see, it just plugs in right there in that first micro USB port up there at the top. Alright, so we've covered the power cable. Next on the list is the OTG cable, or what's also referred to as the on-the-go cable. And this little cable is very vital to the setup that we have here, because on one end it is attaching to the Raspberry Pi Zero via a micro USB, and then on the other end it is basically creating a USB port which will allow us to plug things into this cable, such as a USB dongle, basically allowing us to make use of a wireless keyboard or any type of keyboard for that matter. And that's going to be very important when it comes to setting up and using the Raspberry Pi Zero. I have in the past used a setup like this where I will use an OTG cable, and then attached to the OTG cable I will have a USB hub, so that I now have 3 available USB ports, and then I might have a wireless keyboard and mouse set up plugged into 1 or 2 of those USB ports, and then I'm making use of the other USB port, and I might be using an external Wi-Fi adapter, or maybe plugging a USB into it. There's a lot of reasons why you would want to have one of these cables handy. Alright, moving right along. This next little piece that you see here, this is an HDMI adapter. What this allows us to do is, by plugging this into the Raspberry Pi Zero, it allows us to in turn use a full-size HDMI cord to connect the Raspberry Pi Zero to a monitor or to a TV that you're using as a monitor. Alright, the next thing on the list here, we have a micro SD card. We are using a 16 gigabyte micro SD card for our build here. You can use an 8 gigabyte SD card, or you can use a 16 gigabyte. You can use a 32 gigabyte. If you have one laying around, you can make use of it so that you don't have to go out and buy a new one. But we definitely are going to need a micro SD card that is at least 8 gigabytes in size. If you're not familiar with how all of this works, the micro SD card is absolutely vital to a Raspberry Pi, as it stores the operating system and all of its files. You cannot have a functioning Raspberry Pi without a micro SD card or something that is taking the place of. Now, I've had to purchase a lot of SD cards over the course of many Raspberry Pi projects, and even when I wanted to purchase 8 gigabyte micro SD cards, it made more sense economically just to go with the 16 gigabyte. They were basically the same price, so more times than not you're going to find that you're going to be better off just getting a 16 gigabyte. Now, in the next video, one of the things that we're going to be doing is we are going to flash this micro SD card with an operating system that is called Raspbian. It is the default go-to operating system. So we're going to need yet another adapter. This is an adapter that is going to allow us to get this micro SD card into a computer or some type of device that will allow us to flash this micro SD card. And that's where one of these two adapters will come in handy. I like to keep both around, as sometimes I use one and then sometimes I prefer to use the other, depending on the situation, depending on which device I'm using to flash the micro SD card. Okay, so this first one here is a micro SD to SD adapter. This one tends to be my go-to choice when I am using my laptop. I insert the micro SD into the SD adapter, and then I insert the SD adapter into the side of my laptop, and it's ready to be flashed. This second type here is probably less common, but this is what you would call micro SD to USB. Now, I do actually use this type as well. This type comes in handy for me when I am trying to do everything on my Raspberry Pis, and I am able to use this and plug it into the USB port on my Raspberry Pi 4, and then I am able to use my Raspberry Pi 4 to flash the micro SD card. Alright, now this next one, I would say that this is optional, but if you're able to, get yourself some heat sinks, okay? Especially since we're talking about the Raspberry Pi Zero here, and it does not use a fan. Heat sinks are going to enable your Raspberry Pi Zero to dissipate heat, and believe it or not, your Raspberry Pi Zero does produce a lot of heat. If you are able to dissipate more of that heat, it's just going to allow your Raspberry Pi Zero to function better. For this example here, I'm just going to use one of the three that typically comes in a pack, and I'm going to use the biggest one, and I'm going to place that heat sink right on top of the CPU. Now when you go to use one of these, gently press the heatsink down onto the CPU, and when I say gently, I mean gently. One of the mistakes that I have made in the past is I would mash that thing onto the CPU, and not realizing that at some point off in the future I was gonna have to reuse that Raspberry Pi for a different project, and that next project that I was using it for, there was going to be no room for that heatsink. That heatsink was going to be in the way. I've had this happen multiple times, and what happens is I end up trying to pry this heatsink off of the Raspberry Pi, and that's no good because now we are risking the damage that we could cause. I've learned from my mistakes, and now whenever I put one of these heat sinks on, I make sure that I do so just very gently so that it is not hard to pull it back off in the future if need be. You want to keep your Raspberry Pi cool. Keeping it cool is going to allow it to perform better. It's going to allow it to last longer, and an easy and quick way to help with keeping it cooler is to use the heat sinks, especially with the Raspberry Pi Zero, because you typically don't have an onboard fan like you would with a Raspberry Pi 4. Now once you put the heatsink on the Raspberry Pi, in case you are wondering, it still allows room to put a cover on top. Now we're going to put the Raspberry Pi Zero into its case. Now there is a tab right here, so when putting this in, you do want to try to get the edge of the Raspberry Pi Zero underneath that tab and then kind of just wiggle it in there. There's a couple different ways that you can do this, and you can apply a little bit of pressure. You're not going to hurt anything here, but one way or another, you're going to want to make sure that this gets in there flush and that it looks like this. So now we got the Raspberry Pi Zero sitting inside the case, and we have the heatsink on top of the CPU, and as you can see, there's no problems. The top still fits on top of the case. Everything is fine, and we are good to go. And this is what it looks like when you are all finished. Now, in this video, we did not actually flash the SD card. That is going to be a topic that we are going to go more in depth in the following video. So stay tuned.